I never imagined the day my own daughter would look at me like I was a threat. Not angry, not emotional, just cold, like she had already decided who I was without asking me a single question. I was standing in the living room I paid for, the same room where I once slept on the floor so she could have the bed. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. I asked her one simple question, the kind only a mother asks when she's already afraid of the answer. Why are you doing this to me? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just said, I can't trust you anymore. That sentence hit harder than any scream ever could, because trust was the one thing I thought I had earned. I replayed every sacrifice in my head in seconds, every late night, every skipped dream, every time I chose her future over my comfort. And suddenly, none of it mattered. I was no longer her mother in that moment. I was the problem. She told me she had finally opened her eyes. She said she saw the truth about me now. But the truth she described wasn't my life. It sounded rehearsed, like words borrowed from someone else's mouth. I noticed how she avoided eye contact, how her phone stayed face down on the table, how she kept repeating the same phrases, as if saying them enough times would make them real. I felt something crack inside me, not just my heart, but my sense of reality. Because when your own child believes a version of you that never existed, you start questioning everything. You wonder if love can be erased, if memory can be rewritten, if sacrifice can be used as evidence against you. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to list everything I'd done for her, but I didn't, because I could tell this wasn't about facts. It was about influence. Someone had gotten to her before I could. As she walked toward the door, she paused and said something that still echoes in my chest. I need space. From you. The door closed behind her, and the house went silent. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding between a mother and daughter. This was a betrayal already in motion, and I was the last one to know why. Before I became the woman my daughter turned away from, I was just a mother trying to survive. My name is Linda. I'm 58 years old, and I've lived in Ohio my entire life. I raised my daughter, Emily, alone after her father walked out when she was 9. One morning, he packed a bag, said he needed space, and never came back. From that day on, everything in our life depended on me. I worked 2 jobs most years, sometimes 3. I cleaned offices at night and stocked shelves before sunrise. I learned how to stretch groceries, how to hide exhaustion behind a smile, how to cry silently in the bathroom so my daughter wouldn't hear it through the walls. Emily was a sensitive child, smart, curious. She used to ask big questions at bedtime about the future, about whether people ever stop loving each other, about why some homes felt warm and others felt empty. I didn't always have answers, but I always stayed until she fell asleep. When money was tight, I told her I wasn't hungry. When bills piled up, I told her everything was fine. When fear crept in, I swallowed it. I didn't want her to grow up feeling unstable the way I had. Every decision I made revolved around one goal: give her a life where she wouldn't have to choose survival over dreams. I was there for every school event, even when I came straight from work in a stained uniform. I clapped the loudest at her graduation. I helped her move into her first apartment. I paid for college tuition I couldn't afford because I believed education was freedom. When she struggled in her 20s, lost jobs, bad relationships, moments of self-doubt, I never said I told you so. I opened my door, I sent money, I listened. I thought that was what love looked like. I never asked for recognition, I never kept score. I believed that one day she would understand, not because I reminded her, but because time reveals truth. We talked almost every day back then. She called me on her drive home. We shared recipes, laughed about old memories, complained about the same aches. She told me I was her best friend. That's what makes the silence so confusing now. Because I didn't change, my love didn't change, my intentions didn't change, but something shifted in her. The calls slowed, the warmth faded, conversations became careful, guarded, like she was watching what she said around me. When I asked if everything was okay, she said she was just busy. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Looking back, I realized I was holding on to the past while something else was shaping her present. I didn't know someone was planting seeds, quietly, consistently, until doubt took root where trust used to live. I thought our bond was unbreakable. I was wrong. And by the time I realized it, the story she believed about me was already written without my voice in it. The betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, wearing the disguise of distance. At first, it was small things. Emily stopped calling on her drive home. When I texted, hours passed before I got a reply. Short, careful messages that felt measured, not natural. I told myself she was busy, that adulthood changes rhythms, that I was imagining the shift because I was afraid of being left behind. But then, the warmth disappeared. When we did talk, she sounded guarded, like she was choosing her words around me instead of speaking freely. Jokes fell flat, stories stopped mid-sentence, and sometimes there was an edge in her voice, an irritation that didn't match the conversation. I asked her once, gently, if I had done something to upset her. She sighed and said, "It's not that simple." That sentence stayed with me. Soon after, she began setting boundaries. That was the word she used. Boundaries about when I could call. Boundaries about what I could ask. Boundaries about how involved I was allowed to be in her life. I tried to respect them, even though they felt sudden and confusing. What hurt wasn't the boundaries, it was the accusation behind them. She started implying that I had always been controlling, that my concern was manipulation, that my support came with conditions. These were ideas I had never heard from her before, but now she spoke them with certainty. The first time she said, "You've always made everything about you," I went quiet, because I didn't recognize the woman she was describing. I asked where this was coming from. I asked what I could do to fix it. I asked if we could talk, really talk, without defensiveness. She told me she needed time to process the truth. That word again, truth. But no one would tell me what that truth was. Then I heard it from someone else. A mutual friend mentioned, casually, that Emily had been opening up about her childhood, that she was finally talking about how damaging I had been, that she felt emotionally suffocated growing up. My chest tightened as I listened. The stories being told weren't exaggerated versions of real events. They were distortions, moments taken out of context, intentions rewritten as control, love reframed as guilt. I wanted to confront Emily immediately, but something held me back, a fear that if I pushed too hard, I would only confirm whatever picture had already been painted of me. So I waited. And while I waited, the distance hardened into something else. She stopped inviting me to family events. She stopped telling me about important decisions. When I tried to show up, I felt tolerated, not welcomed. One night, I asked her directly if someone had been influencing her opinions about me. She went silent. Then she said, "I've just started listening to people who see things clearly." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just her voice anymore. Someone else had been shaping my memories. Someone else had been feeding me a version of me that fit their narrative. And the most painful part wasn't that she listened. It was that she believed them without ever asking me if it was true. By the time I realized how far the betrayal had gone, I was no longer just her mother. I was the villain in a story I never agreed to tell. After that, the pressure didn't come from arguments. It came from silence, from exclusion, from being slowly erased. Emily didn't confront me directly anymore. She didn't yell or accuse me to my face. Instead, she pulled back in ways that were impossible to challenge without looking guilty. If I asked why she hadn't invited me, she said she forgot. If I asked why she hadn't told me something important, she said she didn't think I'd understand. Every answer carried the same message: you are no longer safe to me. Family gatherings became unbearable. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. I caught people watching me carefully, like they were waiting for me to prove something they had already decided about me. I felt like I was on trial without knowing the charges. I started questioning myself. I replayed old moments in my head. Every time I gave advice she didn't ask for, every time I worried out loud, every time I stepped in to help without being invited. I wondered if I had crossed lines without realizing it, if love, over time, had turned into something heavier. That doubt was suffocating. I tried apologizing, not for specific actions, but for the pain she said she felt. I told her I was sorry if I had ever made her feel controlled or unheard. I told her I wanted to understand. I told her I was willing to change. She listened politely. Then she said, "This isn't about apologies. It's about accountability." Accountability for what, she wouldn't say. The more I tried to soften, the firmer her distance became. She spoke to me like someone trained to stay emotionally detached, calm, careful, almost rehearsed. And every time I expressed hurt, she framed it as manipulation. "You're making this about you again," she'd say. So I stopped expressing hurt. That's when the pressure moved inward. I stopped sleeping. I lost weight. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, hoping it was her, dreading that it might be something worse. I felt like I was constantly one misstep away from losing her forever. Then the whispers turned into consequences. A cousin called to tell me Emily had asked people not to share information with me. A family friend mentioned Emily was protecting herself from my influence. Someone I trusted gently suggested therapy for me. That suggestion hurt more than I expected, because it implied that whatever was happening wasn't mutual conflict, it was my problem. I began to feel isolated inside my own family. I was careful with my words, my tone, my reactions. I walked on eggshells, afraid that any emotion would be used as proof of what they already believed about me. The worst moment came when Emily told me she needed indefinite space. No timeline, no conditions, no reassurance, just distance. She said it was for her healing. I asked if there was any way to stay connected while she healed. She said no. That night, I sat alone in the house that once felt full of laughter and noise, and I realized something terrifying. I was being pushed out of my daughter's life step by step, and I was expected to accept it quietly or risk confirming every accusation made against me. I felt trapped between silence and self-respect, and somewhere beneath the fear, a new thought began to form, one I wasn't ready to admit yet. This wasn't just emotional distance. This was preparation. Preparation for something I didn't yet see coming. The real escalation didn't begin with a conversation. It began with an envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped through my mail slot like any other piece of junk mail. Plain, unmarked. I almost threw it aside, but when I opened it, my hands went numb. It was formal. Legal language, carefully worded, and at the bottom, my daughter's name. I read it 3 times before it made sense. Emily was requesting that all communication go through a third party. She wanted documentation of our interactions. She was protecting her mental health. That phrase again, polite, clinical, impossible to argue with. I wasn't being asked to step back. I was being positioned as a risk. I tried calling her. It went straight to voicemail. I texted, no reply. I stared at the phone, realizing how powerless I had become in my own story. Soon after, the social consequences followed. Friends I had known for decades stopped checking in. Invitations dried up. Conversations felt strained, cautious. I heard pieces of things through others. Emily was setting boundaries. Emily was finally standing up for herself. Emily had been through a lot. No one asked me what I had been through. Then I noticed changes in my finances, small at first, confusing charges, accounts I hadn't checked in months suddenly inaccessible. When I called the bank, they explained changes had been made with consent. Consent I didn't remember giving. My stomach dropped. I began gathering documents, emails, old messages, anything that could help me understand how much had changed without my knowledge. Every discovery made the situation feel less emotional and more calculated. When I finally confronted Emily about the letter and the accounts, she didn't deny anything. She said, "This is what my advisor recommended." Advisor, not therapist, not mediator, advisor. I asked who that was. She told me it wasn't important. But it was important, because this was no longer just about hurt feelings or misunderstood intentions. Decisions were being made that affected my autonomy, my finances, my relationships, without my involvement. I told her I felt blindsided, that I felt erased. She accused me of playing the victim. That word cut deep. Because victims don't usually get legal letters from their own children. Victims don't wake up to find their lives reorganized by people who claim it's for their own good. The arguments escalated quickly after that. Not loud arguments, controlled ones. The kind where everything you say is documented, reframed, and used later. I started noticing how every interaction felt strategic. She asked questions that seemed designed to get specific responses. She repeated phrases like pattern of behavior and long-term impact. None of it sounded like her. I realized then that this wasn't about resolving the past. It was about establishing a narrative, one where I was unstable, one where I was harmful, one where removing me from the picture could be justified. And the most frightening part was how calmly it was all happening. No chaos, no drama, just quiet, steady escalation. That night, sitting alone with papers spread across my table, I understood something I had been avoiding. This conflict wasn't spiraling out of control. It was being guided, step by step, toward an outcome I hadn't agreed to. And if I didn't change how I responded, I wasn't just going to lose my relationship with my daughter, I was going to lose my voice entirely. The turning point didn't come from a confrontation. It came from a crack in the story I had been handed. I was sitting at my kitchen table one morning, staring at the same stack of papers I had memorized by heart, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Almost. The woman on the other end introduced herself carefully. She said she had worked closely with someone connected to my daughter. She sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be calling at all. Then she said a name Emily had dismissed as not important. My chest tightened instantly. The woman told me she felt uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. She said she had overheard conversations about strategy, about timing, about how to present things. She told me my name came up often, usually followed by words like unstable, manipulative, emotionally unsafe. I felt sick listening to her, because what she was describing wasn't concern, it was planning. She explained that certain moments from my past had been cherry-picked, stripped of context, and reframed to fit a narrative that justified cutting me out. That advice had been given, not to heal a relationship, but to control it. When the call ended, my hands were shaking, but something else was happening beneath the fear. Clarity. For the first time in months, the confusion lifted just enough for me to see the shape of what I was dealing with. This wasn't my daughter waking up to truth. This was my daughter being guided toward a conclusion. I didn't call Emily after that. Instead, I started documenting everything. I organized timelines, saved voicemails, pulled bank records, screenshotted messages that showed warmth right up until the moment the story changed.
I compared dates, when certain ideas first appeared, when certain people entered her life, when the language she used suddenly shifted. Patterns emerged. The words she repeated weren't her own. The timing wasn't accidental. The escalation wasn't emotional. It was procedural. That realization changed how I felt. I stopped apologizing for things I didn't do. I stopped chasing explanations from someone who had already been given answers by others. I stopped shrinking to fit a version of myself that made people comfortable. For the first time, I protected myself. I consulted my own advisor, not to retaliate, but to understand my rights. I learned where lines had been crossed. I learned what consent actually looked like on paper. I learned that silence could be interpreted as agreement. That knowledge was terrifying, but also grounding. When I finally spoke to Emily again, my voice was different, calmer, firmer, no desperation. I told her I loved her. I told her I wanted a relationship built on truth, not accusations filtered through others. I told her I would not accept decisions being made about my life without my involvement. She accused me of being defensive. I told her I was being clear. That was the moment I felt the shift, not in her, but in me. Because whether she was ready to hear the truth or not, I finally was. And once you see manipulation for what it is, you can't unsee it. The story was about to change, not because I demanded it, but because I was no longer willing to play the role I'd been assigned.
The truth didn't come out in a scream. It came out in a room where no one expected it to. Emily agreed to meet after weeks of silence, but only if there were witnesses, a mediator, a family member, someone neutral. I said yes, because by then, I had nothing left to protect except the truth. We sat across from each other at a long table. She looked composed, prepared. I recognized the posture. Chin up, shoulders back, the same way she used to walk into college interviews, confident in the story she believed. I let her speak first. She listed grievances in a calm, measured tone, moments from childhood, choices I'd made, words I'd said, each one presented as proof of long-term harm. The mediator nodded, taking notes. I didn't interrupt, because I knew something she didn't. When it was my turn, I didn't argue feelings. I didn't deny her emotions. I spoke in facts. I placed documents on the table, timelines showing warmth, support, constant contact right up until a specific point. I played voicemails where she thanks me for always being there. I showed messages sent after the supposed period of emotional harm, filled with trust and affection. Then I introduced the third voice in the room, the advisor. I showed records of guidance given to Emily, phrases she had repeated word for word. I showed how moments from my past had been reframed in writing, labeled, categorized, and turned into conclusions. The mediator stopped writing. Emily's expression changed, not anger, not sadness, confusion. I kept going. I laid out the financial changes, the consent forms, the dates that didn't align with the story of sudden realization. I showed how access had been restricted before any conversation with me had taken place. Finally, I asked one question. When did you decide I was unsafe? Before or after someone told you I was? The room went silent. Emily looked down at the table. For the first time, she didn't have a phrase ready. She didn't look certain. She whispered, I thought I was seeing things clearly. That's when the truth landed. Not like an explosion, but like a collapse. The mediator spoke carefully. The family member shifted uncomfortably. The narrative that had painted me as dangerous suddenly had holes no one could ignore. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I said one thing. I was never perfect, but I was present, and I don't deserve to be erased. Emily started crying then, not the controlled kind, the kind that comes when certainty falls apart. She admitted she hadn't questioned the advice she was given, that she had trusted the authority behind it more than her own memories.
that she had been afraid of being told she was wrong for doubting the advice. That confession changed everything, not because it healed us instantly, but because the lie could no longer survive. The truth didn't destroy my daughter. It freed her, and it freed me too, because for the first time since this began, the story belonged to reality, not manipulation. But as the meeting ended, I knew something else. Truth brings clarity. It doesn't guarantee reunion. That part was still ahead.
When everything was finally said, there was no dramatic ending, no sudden forgiveness, no emotional reunion, just space. After that meeting, Emily didn't call for days. I didn't chase her. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I allowed silence to exist without fear, not as punishment, but as protection. I focused on restoring what had been quietly taken from me. My financial access was returned. Decisions stopped being made in my absence. My name, at least legally and socially, was no longer attached to words like unstable or unsafe. Justice didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with dignity. Emily reached out weeks later, not as my daughter needing comfort, but as an adult learning humility. Her message was short, careful. She said she needed time to understand how easily trust can be redirected when fear is fed. I told her I understood, and I meant it. We began rebuilding slowly, without pretending the damage hadn't happened. Conversations stayed shallow at first, no revisiting the past, no assigning blame, just honesty about boundaries, hers and mine. Because I learned something important through all of this. Closure doesn't require reconciliation. It requires truth. I stopped measuring my worth by whether my daughter chose me immediately. I stopped shrinking myself to be accepted. I stopped apologizing for existing in her life. I returned to myself. If you've ever been misunderstood by someone you gave everything to, tell me in the comments. I read every story, and you are not alone. I reconnected with friends who had quietly waited for the truth to surface. I filled my home with routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks, quiet dinners, laughter that didn't ask permission. And if this story reminded you of someone who's silently hurting, please share this video with them. Sometimes hearing another woman's truth is the first step toward their own. Emily and I speak now, not every day, not the way we once did, but with respect. She has apologized, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, and I accepted it without reopening wounds that no longer needed to bleed. Some relationships don't go back to what they were. They become something else, something more honest, something less dependent, something real. If you want more real, voiced-over stories about family betrayal, healing, and reclaiming your identity, subscribe to this channel. These stories are for women who were strong for too long and silent for even longer. That's how my story ended, not with loss, but with myself.